Ethan Calloway stepped out of the sleek black car onto the rain-slicked pavement, the city lights reflecting off puddles like shattered glass, his tailored suit perfectly pressed yet unable to hide the weight he carried in his chest. At 30, he had built an empire that newspapers called untouchable. Yet no fortune could shield him from the loneliness clawing at his ribs or the quiet ache of a heart condition he refused to name aloud, a secret guarded as tightly as the memories of a betrayal that had fractured him years ago. Tonight, against his better judgment, he had agreed to a blind date arranged by a persistent colleague, though every instinct screamed to turn back, to avoid yet another disappointment. Yet something unexplainable kept his feet moving toward the soft glow of the restaurant ahead, as if fate had its hand at his back. Inside, Lila Monroe adjusted the strap of her modest yet elegant blue dress, nerves fluttering like restless birds in her chest, her hazel eyes scanning the room for a stranger she knew nothing about except a first name, her hands trembling, not because she feared meeting someone new, but because the weight of her life left little room for mistakes. Her parents' sudden death 2 years ago had thrust her into the role of provider and protector for her younger sister, forcing her to work double shifts at the hospital, trading sleep for survival and dreams for duty. She never thought of love. Not really. Love felt like a luxury reserved for people who didn't have overdue rent notices tucked in their bags or exhaustion stitched into their bones. Yet her best friend insisted she deserved one night where the world didn't demand so much of her. When Ethan entered, the air shifted. Sharp blue eyes swept the room with detached precision, landing on her almost reluctantly, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Two strangers tethered by something that I couldn't name. Their first words were polite, small talk wrapped in nervous laughter. But beneath the surface, an ocean of unspoken pain rippled quietly between them. He noticed the faint scar near her wrist she unconsciously traced when silence stretched too long. She noticed how he averted his gaze whenever the conversation brushed too close to family. The waiter brought water, menus untouched, and still they sat, unsure why this moment felt heavier than it should, why a blind date felt like a crossroads. Lila caught him studying her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression not one of judgment, but of quiet curiosity, as though he was trying to memorize something he didn't understand. Ethan found himself softening in ways that unnerved him. Her laugh, unpolished and sincere, cracked through the armor he'd spent years perfecting, and for the first time in forever, he didn't feel like a headline or a bank account, just a man sitting across from a woman who somehow saw past all that. Conversation stumbled, then deepened. She spoke of her sister with protective tenderness. He shared fragments of childhood memories he hadn't voiced in years, and though neither confessed their heaviest burdens, they sensed them in each other, as if two broken souls recognized the fractures they both carried. At one point, their hands brushed, reaching for the same glass, a fleeting touch that sent warmth racing up Lila's arm and startled Ethan enough to draw a quiet breath. Sometimes, strangers see the wounds we hide better than the people we love, and in that single, accidental moment, both felt something shift. When the night ended, Ethan walked her to the door, the city's hum wrapping around them like distant music, and for a fleeting second under the soft glow of the street lamp, he allowed himself to wonder what it would be like to not feel so alone. Her smile didn't just light the room. It lit the darkness he carried for years, and as Lila whispered a soft goodbye, unaware of the storm she had just stepped into, Ethan watched her disappear into the night, knowing life had just drawn a line between before and after, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3 days passed, yet Ethan Calloway couldn't shake the image of Lila Monroe's quiet smile beneath the street lamp from his mind. It haunted him through restless nights and endless meetings, a gentle warmth colliding violently with the storm inside him. And when news came that his grandmother's condition had worsened and her final wish echoed through the hospital halls, to see him settled before she went under the knife, something inside him snapped, compelling him toward a decision even he barely understood. A reckless leap born not of love but of desperation, perhaps even survival. When he entered the hospital where Lila worked, the sterile smell of antiseptic and faint cries from distant wards clashing against the polished coldness of his usual world, she didn't notice him at first. Too busy comforting a frightened child in the waiting area, her voice soft yet strong, her presence a quiet anchor amidst chaos, and for a moment Ethan simply watched, captivated not by beauty alone, but by the unassuming grace of someone who gave without expecting anything in return. When she finally turned and saw him standing there, confusion flickered across her hazel eyes. Why was a man like him here, unannounced, out of place among weary nurses and anxious families? And before she could ask, Ethan stepped closer, tension radiating from him like heat off asphalt, his voice low yet steady as he uttered 2 words that shattered the air between them. "Marry me." Lila froze, heart pounding in disbelief. the weight of exhaustion and duty colliding with sheer shock. She almost laughed, thinking it cruel, some twisted jest from a man too rich to understand what such words cost. But when she met his gaze, there was no mockery, only raw desperation hidden beneath carefully measured calm. She stammered, "Question." Ning, incredulous. Why would a millionaire propose marriage to a nurse he barely knew, a woman whose life was stitched together with late bills and sleepless nights? And then came the truth, heavy and heartbreaking. His grandmother, the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally, was slipping away, her last request before surgery to see him married, to believe he wasn't doomed to die alone. Silence stretched between them, louder than any words, and in that silence, Lila saw not the arrogant billionaire the tabloids adored, but a lonely man standing on the edge of something he couldn't face alone. She hesitated, torn between logic and empathy, knowing this wasn't her burden yet, unable to walk away from someone silently pleading for help. Finally, she whispered yes, not for money, not for status, but because some hearts are too kind to ignore another's quiet breaking. The moment word of their engagement spread, chaos erupted like wildfire through Ethan's elite circles, whispers of scandal and disbelief laced with cruel laughter. High society couldn't fathom why the untouchable Callaway heir would choose a nobody nurse, and at the center of the uproar stood Vanessa Hart, his ex-fiancée, beautiful, calculating, and venomous. Her pride shredded by humiliation and her obsession reignited into something darker. Vanessa's perfectly painted smile hid the storm brewing in her chest as she vowed to destroy the woman who dared take what she believed was hers, her manipulative whispers slithering into the ears of those eager to see Lila fail. Meanwhile, Lila found herself thrust into a world she never asked for, where every glance felt like a judgment, every headline a dagger. Yet through it all, Ethan remained steady, guarding her with a quiet ferocity that both terrified and comforted her. As days blurred into nights, their fake engagement became a strange tether, neither fully understood, bound by a promise neither expected to make yet too entangled to undo. And though love wasn't the reason for the proposal, loneliness was, something fragile and unnamed began to bloom in the cracks of their carefully constructed lie, whispering promises neither dared to speak. For sometimes life doesn't wait for love to grow. It throws you into it, unprepared yet unwilling to step back, forcing two broken souls to wonder if what began as pretend might one day become the most real thing they'd ever known. The announcement of their engagement had barely settled before Lila found herself thrust into the lion's den, the sprawling Callaway estate, a world of marble halls, crystal chandeliers, and whispered judgments that clung to her like invisible thorns. Ethan walked beside her, his hand a steady presence at the small of her back. But even his reassuring touch couldn't silence the pounding in her chest as the heavy oak doors opened to reveal the family she would now face, each pair of eyes carrying its own brand of scrutiny. At the center stood Margaret Callaway, regal and unyielding, her perfectly styled hair and icy stare radiating disapproval without a single word. Lila offered a polite greeting, voice trembling yet steady enough to mask her unease. But Margaret's gaze sliced through her composure, stripping her down to every insecurity she tried so hard to hide, dismissing her with a subtle arch of an eyebrow as if she were nothing more than a gold digger who'd stumbled too close to the fire. Polite conversation quickly spiraled into passive-aggressive interrogations, questions about her family, her career, even her motives, each one sharpened to wound rather than welcome. While Ethan, who had mastered the art of silence in this household, clenched his jaw, fury simmering behind his calm exterior, as he watched the woman who had raised him tear into the woman he had brought home. Outside those walls, Vanessa Hart seized the chaos like a predator scenting blood, weaving venomous tales of Lila's supposed ambition into social circles and boardrooms alike. Poisoning Ethan's reputation and turning longtime partners into wary skeptics. Headlines screamed betrayal. Whispers grew louder, and everywhere Lila turned, eyes followed her with a mixture of pity and contempt she neither earned nor deserved. Through it all, she remained composed, her gentle spirit refusing to answer cruelty with more cruelty. And it was this quiet resilience that began to chip away at the frost encasing Ethan's heart. He found himself watching her more than he should, admiring not her beauty, though undeniable, but the way she carried herself amid storms designed to break her. Late one evening, after enduring another dinner laced with silent daggers, they found themselves alone on the balcony, the night air cool against flushed cheeks, the city lights stretching like a map of possibilities below. For a long time they said nothing, content in the quiet, until Ethan's voice broke the silence, low and rough, confessing something he'd never dared speak aloud. How he once had a brother Daniel whose laughter had been the soundtrack of his childhood, and how one reckless night, A car accident stole that laughter forever, leaving Ethan with scars no one could see and a guilt that never loosened its grip. Lila listened, not interrupting, not judging, simply standing close enough for him to feel her warmth, and in her silence, he heard comfort. In her gaze, he found a home. For behind every cold man is a storm he never asked to survive, and as Ethan's walls crumbled brick by brick, he realized that for the first time since tragedy struck, someone saw him. Not the name, not the fortune, but the man quietly breaking beneath both. And in that fragile moment, beneath a canopy of stars and unsaid promises, a bond was forged. Not in grand gestures or declarations, but in shared pain and the unspoken vow that neither would let the other face their storms alone. The Neeks. G8 after Ethan's quiet confession on the balcony, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something still remained unsaid, a deeper shadow lingering behind his blue eyes, and when she stumbled upon the folder in his study, a folder carelessly left open on the polished desk, her entire world tilted. Words she didn't fully understand screamed at her from the page. Rare cardiomyopathy, progressive deterioration, high-risk surgery, and suddenly every moment, every strange hesitation, every unspoken fear clicked into place like cruel puzzle pieces, revealing that the man who proposed to her wasn't just desperate for his grandmother's happiness. He was quietly bracing for his own possible end. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the papers to her chest, heart pounding with a mixture of betrayal and sorrow, because he hadn't trusted her with this truth, hadn't given her the choice to walk into this arrangement knowing the storm she would face. When Ethan found her in the doorway, papers trembling in her hands, his face drained of color, and silence thundered louder than any argument, until finally he whispered the truth she already knew. He was sick, and he didn't know how much time he had. Lila's breath hitched, anger and compassion warring inside her, wanting to scream for the lie and yet reach for him because of the fear she saw in his eyes. Sometimes love begins not with fireworks, but with shared scars, he murmured, voice breaking, admitting that he never wanted pity but needed someone to care for his grandmother if he didn't make it. She listened, torn apart, wondering if she was strong enough to stay beside a man whose future was as uncertain as her own fragile heart. Meanwhile, across the sprawling estate, Vanessa's poisonous whispers wound their way into Margaret Calloway's ear. Each lie spun with surgical precision, painting Lila as a schemer, an orphan desperate to climb out of her poverty by clinging to the Calloway name. Margaret, already skeptical, absorbed every cruel insinuation, her disapproval sharpening into resolve, and together they plotted to sabotage the upcoming wedding. Deciding to reveal Lila's orphan past at the engagement dinner, dressing it as concern while secretly intending humiliation. Lila, wandering the halls that night, overheard them through a partially closed door. Vanessa's mocking laughter, Margaret's clipped agreement, words like unworthy and embarrassment, cutting deeper than any blade. And she froze, hands trembling, chest aching with a pain that felt heavier than anything she'd endured before. Quiet tears spilled down her cheeks as she backed away, heartbreaking not just from their cruelty, but from the confirmation that no matter what she did, she would never be enough for Ethan's world. In silence, she packed her small bag, each folded garment a whispered goodbye, intending to slip away before dawn, before anyone could see the girl who dared to dream of belonging. But as she reached the grand doorway, fingers brushing the cold brass handle, Ethan appeared from the shadows, eyes bloodshot, voice raw as he called her name. Not commanding, not cold, but pleading, desperate. "Don't go," he whispered, stepping closer, the walls he'd built around himself crumbling with every word. "Not when I've just started to need you." And in that fragile moment, torn between the betrayal of secrets and the ache of something deeper she didn't yet understand, Lila's heart stood on the precipice of a choice that would change everything. The cruelest betrayals often coming wrapped in whispered lies, and yet somehow, against every reason, she found herself unable to walk away. Ethan didn't let Lila's hand slip from the doorknob that night. Instead, he quietly led her out into the cool darkness, away from the suffocating whispers of the Calloway estate, driving in silence until the city lights faded into winding roads and towering pines that guarded a secluded lake house he hadn't visited in years, a place, untouched by the chaos of his family name. When they arrived, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then heavy, drumming against the wooden roof as lightning illuminated the still water beyond. And for the first time in days, Lila felt like she could breathe. No judging eyes, no cruel rumors, only the sound of the storm and the man beside her whose silence felt strangely safe. Inside, the lake house glowed with the warm flicker of candlelight, power lines cut by the weather, yet somehow adding to the intimacy. shadows dancing along rustic walls as they sat near the fireplace. Two strangers bound by secrets yet drawn by something neither dared name. Hours passed unnoticed as words spilled easier than they ever had before. Lila spoke of her sister's laughter, of dreams abandoned for survival, while Ethan admitted fears he had buried so deep he'd almost forgotten how to voice them, including the nights he lay awake wondering if he'd ever wake again. In those confessions, walls crumbled. Not in dramatic declarations, but in soft understanding, the kind that needs no proof, only presence. At one point, Ethan reached for her hand, tentative yet steady, his thumb brushing her knuckles as if grounding himself in the simple truth of her being there, and when he whispered, "For the first time in years, I feel alive." Lila's breath caught, not from surprise but from the realization that somewhere between chaos and quiet, she had begun to fall for him, not for his wealth or name, but for the broken man beneath it, the one who still had the courage to hope. Thunder rolled overhead, loud yet distant compared to the rhythm of their hearts. Under the thunder, their hearts beat louder than the storm, and without planning to, they stepped out into the rain, laughter bubbling unexpectedly as droplets soaked their clothes, washing away the heaviness of everything they had endured. There, under the open sky, they moved together in an unspoken dance, slow and unhurried, as if the world had finally given them permission to just be. When Ethan finally kissed her, it wasn't rushed or perfect but hesitant, trembling, full of unspoken promises and quiet longing, a kiss that said more than words ever could. Love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers when we need it most. And as the rain mingled with tears neither realized they'd shed, they knew that whatever storms awaited them beyond this night, they had found in each other a fragile, precious refuge worth fighting for. Rain still clung to their clothes as they returned from the lake house, the echo of that fragile kiss haunting both of them in silence. Dawn broke muted and gray, a deceptive calm before the storm of their wedding day, a day neither of them realized would test every thread holding them together. The estate buzzed with opulence, florists rushing with ivory roses, string musicians rehearsing soft melodies, guests in shimmering attire murmuring about the scandalous speed of the engagement. While behind closed doors, Ethan and Lila dressed in quiet contemplation, each lost in their own storm of hope and dread. Lila stood before the mirror, fingers trembling over the delicate lace of her gown, wondering if love could survive the weight of secrets, lies, and families determined to tear them apart. Ethan, across the hall, fastened his tie with hands unsteady from restless nights and unspoken fears, knowing that marrying her was no longer about fulfilling his grandmother's wish, but about defying the walls that had trapped him his entire life. When the ceremony began, whispers followed every step Lila took down the aisle, curious eyes cataloging her orphan past, her modest background, her quiet grace that felt almost foreign in a world of diamond crowns and champagne smiles. Yet when she reached Ethan, the chaos fell away, replaced by a stillness that felt like destiny, their eyes locking in silent vows, unspoken even as the officiant began to speak. But just as the words, "If anyone objects," left his lips, the heavy doors slammed open with a deafening crack, and Vanessa Hart strode in like a tempest in crimson silk, her heels striking the marble in defiance, her perfectly curled hair framing a face twisted in triumph and malice. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she held aloft glossy photographs, her voice sharp enough to slice through the music as she hurled accusations that Lila was unfaithful, that she had been seen with another man, that Ethan was being played for a fool. The photos fluttered to the floor like poisoned petals. Lila laughing with a stranger, walking arm in arm down a street, cropped and angled to tell a damning lie. Margaret Calloway seized the moment, her icy disapproval sharpening into open fury as she stepped forward, condemning Lila in front of everyone, calling her unworthy, a fraud, a girl who had trapped her son with sympathy and deceit. The crowd's murmurs grew into cruel whispers, the weight of judgment suffocating Lila as humiliation burned her cheeks and tears welled in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Ethan stood frozen, torn between the mother he had spent a lifetime trying to please and the woman who had quietly healed him in ways he hadn't known he needed. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence that screamed louder than any accusation, and in that unbearable moment Lila turned, her feet carrying her toward the exit, the whispers of guests trailing behind like knives. Rain greeted her outside, cold and merciless, soaking the delicate lace of her gown as she fled into the night. Sobs swallowed by thunder, the weight of betrayal heavier than the storm itself. Inside, Ethan stood unmoving, his chest hollow, until the truth began to gnaw at him. Something in Vanessa's timing, the two perfect photographs, the familiar cruelty behind her smirk. Retreating to his office, he spread the photos across his desk, examining every detail until the lie unraveled before him. Staged angles, paid actors, timestamps that didn't align. Fury ignited like wildfire in his veins, no longer dulled by years of silence. And for the first time, he allowed himself to burn. He confronted Vanessa in the Great Hall before the same guests who had witnessed Lila's humiliation, his voice thundering through the air as he exposed her lies. Naming the photographer she'd hired, the bribes she'd paid, the manipulation she'd spun to destroy what she could never have. Gasps erupted, faces turned pale, the room that had judged Lila now forced to watch the real villain fall apart. Margaret's protest was sharp but hollow, her authority crumbling beneath the weight of truth as Ethan turned on her too, his voice breaking yet resolute as he severed ties with the family whose approval had cost him his happiness for too long. "The ones we defend blindly are often the ones who wound us most deeply," he said, the confession echoing through stunned silence. "And sometimes heartbreak is the price we pay for finding true love." Without waiting for permission, without caring for the fallout, he walked out into the storm, searching for the woman whose love had become his only refuge, knowing that apologies might not be enough, but determined to prove that for once he would fight for her, not as the Calloway heir, not as the man society expected him to be, but simply as Ethan. Broken and desperate and finally brave enough to love. Rain lashed against Ethan's face as he stumbled out of the Calloway estate into the chaos of the storm, his expensive suit clinging to him like a weight dragging him into the earth. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not when the image of Lila's tear-streaked face burned into his mind, haunting every step. His shoes slipped on slick cobblestones as thunder cracked overhead, drowning the faint murmur of shocked wedding guests still gossiping inside the mansion, their voices already rewriting the story into cruel lies. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was finding her Beth. Or she vanished from his life forever, before the only woman who had ever looked at him without judgment slipped through his fingers for good. Every street corner he turned carried ghosts of her. Laughter, echoes of her whispered confessions at the lake house, and it hurt more than the icy rain cutting through his skin, because he knew she believed she wasn't enough. That the venomous words of his family and Vanessa's lies had convinced her that what they shared was fragile, temporary, a mistake. He would rather drown in this storm than let her live another moment thinking that. Memories of the night they danced in the rain rushed through him, the way her eyes softened when he whispered he felt alive for the first time in years. And that memory became his compass as he scoured the city, searching bus stops, train stations, empty streets lit only by flickering neon, driven not by logic, but by instinct, by the unshakable pull that had tied him to her since the first awkward touch at that blind date. Finally, through the smeared glass of a rundown station on the outskirts of town, he saw her, small and trembling in her torn wedding dress, hunched against the cold bench, eyes fixed on the floor as if she no longer dared look up at the world. Ethan's chest cracked open at the sight, his breath catching as though the air itself had turned solid, and for a moment he stood frozen, afraid that moving toward her might break the fragile thread holding her there. But then she looked up, startled by the sound of his footsteps, hazel eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears, and something inside him shattered completely. He crossed the space between them in seconds, rainwater dripping from his hair onto her gown, yet neither cared about the mess they were. Two souls wrecked by love and lies, standing in the wreckage of everything they thought they knew. "Why are you here?" she whispered, voice trembling, and Ethan sank to his knees before her, heedless of the puddles soaking through his clothes, the cold seeping into his bones. "Because," he choked out, "I can't let you walk away without knowing the truth, without knowing why I asked you to marry me." Her lips parted, confusion flickering across her face, and with trembling hands he reached for hers, holding them as though letting go would mean death. "It wasn't just for my grandmother," he confessed, voice breaking under the weight of secrets he'd carried alone for too long. "It was because I thought I was dying. I've been living with a heart condition for years, one the doctors said I might not survive. Every day felt borrowed, every smile a countdown, and when I met you, I realized if I had to leave this world, I didn't want to leave it empty-handed. I wanted to know you'd be safe, that you'd never struggle again, that even if I was gone, you'd have everything I could give you." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, her throat tightening as she tried to speak, but Ethan pressed on, desperate for her to understand. "I thought money would fix it," he whispered, voice raw, "but then you walked into my life and showed me it was never about money. It was about moments, about laughter, about finally feeling alive. You were my first taste of living, Lila, and I was too much of a coward to admit it." Her sob broke the silence like glass, sharp and unrestrained, And she shook her head fiercely, gripping his hand so tight it hurt. "I don't want your money," she cried, her voice trembling yet steady with conviction. "I don't care about the mansion, or your name, or what anyone thinks. I just want you. I want the man who danced with me in the rain, who whispered that he felt alive, who held me when I couldn't hold myself. I want you, Ethan. Not your fortune, not your fear. You." For the first time in years, Ethan's tears spilled freely, rain and salt mingling as he pulled her into his arms, holding her like the world might end if he loosened his grip. "The richest man," she whispered into his chest, echoing words that would stay with him forever. "Isn't the one with money, but the one with someone willing to stay." Hours later, as dawn broke pale and trembling over the horizon, they found themselves at the hospital, Ethan's surgery looming like a final trial between love and fate. Lila refused to leave his side, her hand in his until the very last moment they wheeled him away, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood, begging the universe for just one more miracle. Time lost meaning in the waiting room. The clock ticked, the storm faded, and every second stretched into eternity until finally, the surgeon appeared, weary, yet smiling. "He made it," the doctor said softly, and Lila collapsed into tears of relief, so pure it felt like flight. When Ethan opened his eyes hours later, weak but alive, the first thing he saw was her, hair disheveled, cheeks tear-streaked, yet radiant in a way that stole his breath more than any illness ever had. She was there, holding his hand, whispering his name like it was both apology and promise. Word of Ethan's survival softened even Margaret Calloway's hardened heart. She entered the room days later, pride crumbling under the weight of humility, and though her apology was quiet, almost awkward, it was real, her trembling hands clasping Lila's as she finally welcomed her into the family. Ethan's grandmother, frail yet glowing with joy, blessed their union with tears in her eyes, calling Lila the answer to prayers she'd whispered through sleepless nights. And then weeks later, when Ethan's strength had returned and the world had calmed, he took Lila to the garden behind the hospital, a quiet place where flowers bloomed defiantly despite the storms they'd endured. There, under a sky finally clear of rain, he knelt again, not with fear, not with desperation, but with love so steady it felt like forever. "This time," he whispered, voice steady despite the tears glistening in his blue eyes, "I'm proposing for the right reason, not because I'm scared, not because I'm dying, but because I can't imagine a life without you. Will you? Marry me, not for tomorrow, but for forever." Lila's tears spilled freely as she nodded, whispering yes with a smile that felt like sunrise after years of night, and when they embraced, the world around them seemed to exhale, the past finally silenced by the promise of what lay ahead. Sometimes, the reason we find love is unbelievable, yet exactly what we need, and as Ethan held her close, he knew he was no longer the man defined by wealth or legacy, but by the quiet miracle of the woman who had chosen to stay through every storm, turning his broken heart into the richest treasure he'd ever know.